See that we have quorum, and I declare this meeting in session. Welcome to this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on National Security, Defence and Veterans Affairs. I'm Tony Dean, Senator from Ontario and the chair of this committee. I'm joined today by fellow committee members and some other senators whom I welcome now to introduce themselves, beginning on my right. Senator Dagenet.
Jean-Guy Dagenet, du Québec.
Sénateur Pierre-Hugues Boisvenu du Québec.
Senator Don Plett, I'm from Manitoba.
Senator, I'm from Ontario.
Andrew Cardozo from Ontario.
Senator Judy White, Newfoundland and Labrador.
Welcome, Artie Deacon, Senator from Ontario.
Stan Kuchar, Nova Scotia.
Dave Richards, New Brunswick.
Julie Méville-de-Chêne, Québec.
San Yusuf, Ontario.
Pat Duncan, Yukon.
Peter Beam, Ontario.
Donna Dasco, Senator from Ontario, and I'm a member of this committee. Thank you.
David Arnott, Senator from Saskatchewan.
Thank you, colleagues. We're also joined by the clerk of the committee, Madame Dupont. For those watching the session today, we begin our study of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments related to firearms. We have the pleasure of welcoming today the Honourable Dominic LeBlanc, Minister of Public Safety, Democratic Institutions and Intergovernmental Affairs. Mr. LeBlanc is accompanied by Mr. Talal Dekalbub, Assistant Deputy Minister, Crime Prevention Branch, Public Safety, Mr. Matthew Taylor, General Counsel and Director of the Criminal Law Policy Section at Justice Canada, and Mark Flynn, Acting Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Thank you all for joining us today. Minister LeBlanc, welcome on behalf of the committee. I now invite you to provide your opening remarks. Please begin whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chair, honourable senators, good afternoon, and thank you for having us at your committee, and thank you for introducing my colleagues from the RCMP, the Public Safety Department, and the Department of Justice who've joined me, and there are other officials as well from different agencies, the Canadian Border Services Agency, for example, and others that I think you'll hear from once I exit your august committee. Mr. Chair, it's a pleasure, as always, to appear before you today, and I thank my colleagues for joining us. I see some old friends at your table. I'm an admirer of the work of what we call the other place. I have a family connection to your chamber. You'll see my father's portrait on the wall when he was Speaker, and he enjoyed immensely the time he served in the Senate, so it's always a privilege for me to be back at a place that he enjoyed so much. Mr. Chair, through legislative measures such as Bill C-21, our government is aiming to tackle gun violence head-on. Since it was introduced last spring, Bill C-21 has been further strengthened through extensive consultations and amendments. We engaged with First Nations, Inuit and Métis organizations, rural and northern communities, victims groups, and with the firearms community and sports persons and sports shooters across Canada to hear their perspectives and to ensure that we respect their traditions and way of life. These consultations have informed our path forward. Le projet de loi C-21 stipule désormais explicitement que rien dans le projet de loi ne déroge aux droits constitutionnels des peuples autochtones et inclut des protections pour les propriétaires d'armes à feu respectueux de la loi afin qu'ils puissent continuer à pratiquer ce qui est de plus en plus et beaucoup plus qu'un passe-temps pour eux. Nous avons également consulté les membres des familles et des communautés touchées par la violence armée. Malheureusement, les communautés les plus vulnérables sont souvent parmi les plus touchées par la violence armée. Nous devons faire tout ce qui est en notre pouvoir pour assurer leur sécurité et celle de tous les Canadiens, et le projet de loi C-21 est un pas important dans cette direction. Cela commence par la lutte contre la prolifération des armes de poing, l'arme de feu le plus couramment utilisée dans les homicides. Ce projet de loi codifierait le gel national des armes de poing qui a été instauré par décret en octobre 2022. Il nous aiderait également à lutter contre le crime organisé en augmentant les peines maximales pour les trafiquants d'armes et en mettant sur pied de nouvelles autorités pour combattre la contrebande d'armes à feu. Le projet de loi s'attaque aussi au phénomène des armes fantômes en resserrant la réglementation entourant des pièces utilisées dans la fabrication de ces armes. Le projet de loi C-21 also introduces new laws to protect victims of intimate partner violence. Victims of intimate partner violence are almost 5 times more likely to be killed if a firearm is present in the home, highlighting the urgency of further curtailing access to firearms for violent individuals. New red flag laws in the bill will allow courts to order the immediate removal of firearms from dangerous individuals. The bill will also codify a technical definition of an assault-style firearm, which will make it illegal to import or manufacture such firearms in Canada going forward. This will enable us to proactively respond to technological advances in the firearms market and keep dangerous weapons, those that aren't used for hunting and sporting, from entering our communities. En complément de ces mesures, des modifications réglementaires seront apportées afin d'imposer une inspection physique obligatoire par la GRC pour tous les nouveaux modèles d'armes à feu avant qu'ils soient mis sur le marché canadien. Ces mesures réglementaires garantiront qu'aucune arme à feu ne pénètre sur le marché canadien sans avoir été répertoriée ou classifiée de manière correcte par des autorités gouvernementales compétentes. Pour régler le problème de la classification des armes à feu, nous rétablissons le Comité consultatif canadien des armes à feu afin qu'il examine de manière indépendante la classification des modèles existants qui tombent sous le coup de la nouvelle définition prospective d'armes prohibées dans le projet de loi C-21 et identifier ceux qui sont qualifiés d'armes à feu de chasse afin de les exclure d'un futur décret qui vise à interdire toutes les armes d'assaut existantes. Enfin, pour compléter les mesures contre les armes d'assaut, nous renforçons la réglementation sur les chargeurs de grande capacité afin d'éliminer les failles et les exemptions qui permettent l'accès à des chargeurs de plus de 5 ou 10 cartouches, respectivement, pour les armes d'épaule et les armes de poing. Ni cette mesure, ni aucune autre disposition du projet de loi, ni aucune autre mesure complémentaire ne vise à retirer les armes à feu aux chasseurs ou aux tireurs sportifs. Ce sont des mesures qui vont nous tous aider à lutter contre le fléau que pose la violence armée. À chaque fois qu'un crime violent se produit dans nos quartiers, dans nos communautés, c'est le sentiment de sécurité des résidents qui est ébranlé. No one measure, Mr. Chair, can address this issue alone. That is why we continue to pursue the implementation of an assault-style firearms buyback program. We are taking the time to get this program right and looking forward to keeping businesses and responsible gun owners apprised of the next steps as we move forward in this direction. At the same time, we are strengthening law enforcement's capacity to stop guns from coming into the country, investigating gun crimes, and enhance their collaboration with provincial and municipal law enforcement partners. And Mr. Chair, this is also a discussion I had with Secretary Mayorkas, the U.S. Homeland Security Secretary, when I was in Washington a few weeks ago, precisely how we can better share information at the border, the Canadian Border Services Agency, with his department, and how we can work together collaboratively to deal with the importation of illegal guns across the Canada-US border. Prevention is also a key pillar of our approach. In collaboration with provincial and territorial partners, we are supporting the development of new gun and gang violence prevention and intervention programs. These investments support prevention and intervention efforts aimed at young people, helping them leave gangs or avoid joining them in the first place. En investissant dans la prévention et dans la répression, nous améliorons la sécurité publique, préviendrons des tragédies et sauverons, on espère, des vies aussi. Mr. Chair, while Bill C-21 is clearly but one element of a broader public safety agenda, we believe it is nonetheless a significant step forward towards enhancing the safety and security of Canadians. And we look forward to the work of this committee, and we hope that you'll be able to pursue us in these efforts. And I look forward to your questions today, and I thank so many colleagues for coming to a meeting on a Monday afternoon. If this was a committee in the other place, you'd have maybe a third of the attendance here, so it's either a good sign, Mr. Chair, or a very bad sign for me, but I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you, Minister. We're about to find out shortly, I think. We'll now proceed to questions. Before proceeding, just a caution. I'd like to ask participants in the room to please refrain from leaning in too closely to the microphone or to remove your earpiece when doing this. This will avoid any sound feedback that could negatively impact the committee staff in the room. I note that Minister LeBlanc will be here with us until 5 p.m. today. We're going to do our best to allow time for each member to ask a question during this first hour. A second round of questions with officials will take place from 5 to 6 p.m. With this in mind, 4 minutes is going to be allocated for each question, including the answer. I ask that you keep your questions succinct in an effort to allow as many interventions as possible. That being said, I now offer the first question to our Deputy Chair, Senator Dagenet.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci, Monsieur le Ministre, de votre présence. Je vais d'abord vous rassurer parce que je vais voter en faveur du C-21. Là, je vois votre beau sourire, mais faites attention parce que j'ai quand même une déception. Ça fait quand même 8 ans que le gouvernement est au pouvoir, puis j'ai comme l'impression qu'il y a une incapacité d'accoucher d'une loi qui aurait un impact significatif sur le crime organisé. Alors, je veux dire par là, on peut parler de meilleure surveillance des frontières, la chasse aux trafiquants d'armes, des peines exemplaires, vous l'avez mentionné pour ceux qui se font prendre, mais on dirait que l'identification des armes prohibées, c'est comme un genre de cafouillis. Puis le C-21, je ne suis pas certain qu'il va réduire les armes à feu illicites qui sont utilisées par les criminels qui commettent des meurtres. Parce que je peux vous dire une chose, si on avait l'occasion d'avoir des membres du crime organisé qui viendraient témoigner, ils vous diraient sûrement que le C-21 ne leur fait pas peur nécessairement. Donc, pouvez-vous nous expliquer qu'est-ce qui motive, je n'oserais pas qualifier le manque de courage, mais pour lutter contre les criminels qui utilisent des armes qui, la plupart du temps, ne sont jamais enregistrées, alors que, par contre, les projets de loi restreignent les droits des chasseurs puis des amateurs de tir qui sont donnés aux citoyens. Donc, à qui on veut faire plaisir là, avec le projet de loi C-21?
Merci, sénateur, pour la question. Et si mes collègues, soit de la GRC ou du ministère, veulent ajouter des précisions, j'espère que ce sera possible. Moi, nous croyons au gouvernement que c'est une mesure importante pour protéger la population. Nous croyons, par exemple, que les autorités additionnelles et ressources additionnelles qu'on donne à l'Agence de services frontaliers fera en sorte que le crime organisé, je suis d'accord avec vous, sénateur, vous avez beaucoup de connaissances dans le domaine de la sécurité publique, ce sera pour nous une occasion d'appuyer nos forces de l'ordre afin de lutter contre ce qui est de plus en plus un sujet d'activité de la crime organisée. Je suis entièrement d'accord avec vous. Nous croyons que nous enlevons rien, nous visons pas du tout, comme j'ai dit, les chasseurs, les sportifs avec ces mesures ici. Les gens que moi je connais au Nouveau-Brunswick qui vont à la chasse vont avec des armes traditionnelles de chasse. On est explicite que ce n'est pas du tout qu'est-ce qu'on vise ici. C'est des armes qui sont à point de départ manufacturier ou fabriqué, je devrais dire, pour tuer des personnes dans un contexte d'agissement militaire. Mais nous croyons Nous comprenons, et vous avez absolument raison, que lutter contre le crime organisé et prévenir une violence armée, c'est pas du tout simplement à l'intérieur d'un projet de loi devant le Parlement. C'est un outil important. Ça fait en sorte que je crois que ça va réduire le nombre de ces fusils en circulation. Mais ça prend aussi un appui aux polices, aux procureurs, ça prend des enquêteurs, pas seulement de la GRC, mais de d'autres forces policières, que ce soit Sûreté de Québec ou dans d'autres provinces, comme les polices municipales. Et c'est une discussion continuelle que j'ai avec mes amis de la GRC, comment nous pourrons appuyer nos partenaires dans ce sens-là.
Vous savez, il y a une différence entre les armes de chasse et de combat. D'ailleurs, durant le week-end, j'ai fait des recherches et j'ai trouvé sur le site Internet, d'ailleurs, je vous ai apporté une copie, le club de tir qui s'appelle l'Ahash Shooting Range à Kanawake. Puis je vais vous inviter à regarder les armes. C'est le type d'arme que je crois avoir vu dans les mains des terroristes en Israël il y a 2 semaines. Au club de tir de Kanawake, sur la rive sud de Montréal, moyennant la somme de 135 $, je peux aller m'entraîner pendant 1 heure avec ce type d'arme automatique qui peut tirer 20 balles en moins de 5 secondes. Estimez-vous que votre projet fixe un cadre raisonnable pour ce genre d'activité avec des armes aussi puissantes que je considère inutiles pour aller à la chasse pour un citoyen normal? Puis quel genre de surveillance existe-t-il sur ce genre d'offre? En fait, vous pourrez montrer les copies d'ailleurs à M. de la GRC. J'ai été un peu surpris de voir qu'il y a des clubs de tir. J'ai déjà été dans un club de tir, puis j'ai jamais vu ça. Alors, mais je vous ai fait une copie. D'ailleurs, on peut peut-être... s'il y a quelqu'un.
I'm afraid, Minister, the 4 minutes is up for this period. It's a guide to other members to, I think, be brief with questions. I'm hoping that officials, this is a good question, I'm hoping that this is an answer that can be provided in the course of this meeting. I'm sure it will be. We're now going to senators, starting with Senator O, followed by Senators Plett, Cardozo, Youssef and Kuchar. Senator O.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. My question is, Minister, gun control is ultimately about controlling legal firearms. If gun control is going to be effective, it must have the support of legal firearms owners. It is very obvious that legal firearms owners are very opposed to this bill. Indigenous people are opposed to the bill. Many frontline police officers have said it will be ineffective. Question for you. How concerned are you that pushing this pro-bill through regardless, you are in fact undermining support for gun controls in Canada?
Senator, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. My colleagues say, with respect to Senator Dagenet, they will have the technical answers because I share his surprise at exactly that, but they'll be happy to come back to that. But with respect to your question, Senator, it may not surprise you. I don't think that Indigenous peoples writ large oppose this bill, and I don't think to say that hunters or sports groups oppose this legislation. There is, every time governments or Parliament legislate in this area, a very quick reaction from hunting groups, sports shooters, many of whom are in my constituency in rural New Brunswick. That's why I think it's important for us to continue to explain and to be able to point in the legislation to why these particular legislative measures, first of all, respect completely Indigenous rights. That's a part that we amended, we added to the bill, because I think in an initial version of this legislation, much of what you identified in your question was a very real concern. That's why I think the legislative process in our place, I hope, to a large extent, attenuated or diminished those concerns. So we are entirely respective of Indigenous Section 35 rights, and we're designing legislation that deliberately targets those who use weapons or want to have weapons that are not, in fact, part of a typical hunter or sports person's routine. So I think that there's broad support in Canada for thoughtful, effective measures to reduce the proliferation and access to military-style assault weapons. Now, I'm not a firearms expert. We have people from the RCMP and others that understand these details better than I do. But I think Canadians in general, having seen tragedies across the country and around the world when these weapons are in the hands of criminals, I think that any measure that reduces the number of these guns that are circulating in communities or that can be imported into Canada or can be sold lawfully, I think is a step in the right direction. But as I said, it requires a series of measures, not simply one legislative measure around gun control.
Minister, the gun control, I think the most important thing is illegal gun coming across from the border. I think those are the serious problems they're creating. I'm from GTA, Toronto, and that's where most of the illegal guns are coming through and being used by the gangs.
So, Senator, I agree with you that that is a significant challenge. As I said in my opening comments, it was, I thought, an interesting discussion I had with the Secretary of Homeland Security in the United States, with the Attorney General of the United States as well. They want the FBI and their border services partners of the Canadian Border Services Agency to work collaboratively with the RCMP and Canadian law enforcement. We had a federal, provincial, and territorial meeting of public safety ministers in Bromont, Quebec, 2 weeks ago. Weeks get blurred. A couple of weeks ago. This was the Quebec minister, Bonardel, very much wanted us to work precisely on some of these points at the border. I think we can do a lot more, and we will.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator O. Senator Plett is next.
Thank you, and I will be succinct. I hope I can get both of my questions in if the minister will cooperate with me on this. Maybe I can get them both in. Minister, you talked briefly in your opening remarks about engagement with Indigenous communities. We, in fact, have a submission from the Mohawk Council of Kaunaki in which they stated there was no consultation. Let me just very briefly read what they say. There is no carve-out in Bill C-21 for the exercise of this inherent jurisdiction, nor was any consultation carried out to solicit our import. Other Indigenous groups, of course, have reported the same. How is that possible, Minister, when this bill clearly impacts them? They are saying no consultation. You are saying engagement.
So, again, Mr. Chair, through you to Senator Plett, that's a very good question. I, again, believe that the elements of this bill, and it's stated clearly in the legislation, are respectful of Indigenous rights. My predecessor, Marco Mendicino, had a series of consultations with Indigenous groups. Talal and I have a list here. We're happy to share that with you, Senator, because it's a good question. I see a number of Indigenous communities that were met with in the winter and spring of this year. With respect to the particular community, Talal, do you have an answer for the Senator?
I'm not going to touch it. Happy to jump in. Actually, I'd like to clarify as well. The bill as it stands right now, there were extensive consultations with Indigenous communities across the country when it was introduced the first time. Exactly.
The question was on this bill.
And this bill as well, when there were amendments introduced, we did further consultation, but most of these amendments were removed from this bill. But I'm happy to share with you the consultations we did.
Thank you. My next question, Minister, you talked about wanting to take the guns, the illegal guns out of criminals, and I don't think there's anybody around this table that doesn't support that. But this, of course, this bill isn't dealing with illegal guns in the hands of criminals. This bill is dealing with legal guns in the hands of hunters and sports shooters. But, you know, if the government is so set on combating gun crime, and your predecessor claimed that your government's goal with this bill is the eradication of gun violence. But under your government, Minister, Bill C-5, you have in fact repealed mandatory sentences for the following: using a firearm or imitation firearm in the commission of an offense, possession of a firearm or weapon knowing its possession is unauthorized, possession of a prohibited or restricted firearm with ammunition, possession of a weapon obtained by commission of an offense, discharging a firearm with intent, robbery with a firearm, and extortion with a firearm. So I'm wondering, Minister, how is this consistent with your goal in trying to eradicate gun violence when you remove, and I know you're going to say they've increased maximum penalties when the 10-year maximum was never handed out in the first place. So increasing maximum isn't what we're concerned about. You've taken away minimums. Why is that, Minister?
So, Senator, again, just to go back to the initial part of your second question, it won't surprise you I don't agree with your characterization that we're taking guns away from lawful hunters and sports persons. That phrase gets repeated over and over again. It doesn't make it true. I just think I want to be careful to make it clear that I disagree with the premise of that question. You talked about legislation that Parliament adopted over a year ago. Matthew can go through some of the specific elements of Bill C-5. We may have a fundamental difference of opinion with respect to the appropriate use of mandatory minimum sentences. I voted as a member of Parliament for a number of mandatory minimum sentences. And I also voted for legislation that I believe brought them in line with some of the constitutional provisions of various court decisions. I would also point, Senator, to the fact that we have given $900 million to provinces and territories precisely to improve law enforcement's ability, our partner law enforcement agencies, to go after the illegal guns and criminals who are using guns. I'd share your premise, Senator, entirely with respect to the fact that the focus has to be on the illegal use of firearms to commit criminal offenses. That should unite us all. On that, I think you and I would agree quite easily.
Thanks, Minister. Senator Cardozo is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Minister, for being here. What I'd like to do is just to read you a couple of paragraphs of interventions that we received and get your input, because that's, at the end of the day, what we have to pass judgment on. So this is from the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters, and this is one of the quotations I want to make. The prohibition of semi-automatic guns will do nothing to prevent crime, as it will not curtail the demand for illicit firearms by guns and those involved in organized crime. They go on to say that tangible benefits to public safety will require non-legislative efforts, including increased funding for border services, improved firearm tracing, and initiatives to tackle gun activity and organized crime. So maybe I can just get your thought on that, and I then want to provide you a quote from the other side of the discussion.
Well, thank you, Senator, for the question. And so, as I said in response to Senator Plett, we do share the view that we have to increase the ability of law enforcement, both on the federal side, the RCMP, the Border Services Agency, but also with our provincial and municipal partners and some Indigenous police forces, so to collaborate with law enforcement to share information, our American partners, as I mentioned. So I accept their view that we also need to invest in the appropriate law enforcement instruments to cut down on the illegal importation of firearms, but to remove what, as we said, are firearms designed not for sports shooting or for hunting, but are designed for in a battlefield context that we don't think should be circulating freely in communities in Canada. And again, I think that the premise that this affects law-abiding gun owners is a phrase that's often used, who pursue sports activities, hunting or sports shooting. We have been explicit and careful to ensure that these measures do not target those people, and in fact allow them to practice their sport and other recreational activities that hunters in my community of rural New Brunswick do, while at the same time giving law enforcement and prosecutors the ability to deal with a particular kind of weapon that has caused much death and destruction in Canada, but to deal with things like ghost guns, to deal with other elements that we think recognize technology evolving and modernize the legislative framework so that police are able to better control those kind of guns.
Thanks very much. Just quickly then, Police se souvient have a different perspective. They'd like the bill passed as soon as possible. And they add, we also hope senators communicate to the government their support for strong regulations aimed at banning current military-style weapons and eliminating all exemptions and loopholes that undermine the so-called ban on large capacity magazines.
So I had an opportunity to speak to representatives of Police se souvient earlier today. In fact, I'm going to meet with them in the coming weeks, I hope in Montreal. I share absolutely their concern. They've expressed it to me. They've expressed it to our department. That's why in my opening comments I thought it was important to publicly commit the government to a series of regulatory, once the bill receives royal assent obviously, work with the appropriate authorities to put quickly into place a regulatory framework that we think will answer many of those questions or many of those concerns that Police se souvient and other groups representing victims of gun violence have advocated for. So I think that we're very much lined up with that sentiment and will do so in an expeditious way should and when this bill receive royal assent.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Minister. Senator Youssef is next, followed by Senator Kuchar and Anderson. Senator Youssef.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister and witnesses, for being here. Minister, I have a couple of questions. I'll try to be as direct and succinct as I can, and maybe I might get them answer. If not, I'll follow up with your officials. So, amendments were introduced in the other place to ensure that the provision enacted through C-21 are to be constructing as upholding Aboriginal and treaty rights of Indigenous people, as recognized and affirmed, of course, by Section 35 of the Constitution, not by abrogating or derogating from them. Can you confirm and explain how treaty rights will be affected by C-21?
So through you, Mr. Chair, Senator Youssef, thank you for the question and thank you for your willingness to sponsor this legislation. So we appreciate it and look forward to working with you and your colleagues in this place. Since last fall, as I mentioned, we have been engaging with Indigenous partners across the country, including Indigenous partners in the Northern Territories as well. I think we understand and certainly can assure those Indigenous peoples that firearms that have been used and passed down for generations in their pursuit of sustenance, hunting, for example, or other activities that they have done lawfully for generations will not be affected, will be untouched by this legislation. These traditions are important for Canadians and Indigenous peoples. This bill won't prevent the pursuit of those traditions. We also thought it was important precisely because of some of the concern when the initial bill was presented, and I think that you're referring to that, to add a non-derogation clause to reaffirm without question that Section 35 constitutional rights of Indigenous people are to be upheld. This definition was co-developed with national Indigenous organizations and reaffirms what we all have known, that the constitutions and rights that Indigenous people hold need to remain protected and should not be affected by a legislative measure. We don't propose in this legislation to take away any firearms that Indigenous people use to hunt or trap. And it's something, as Talal mentioned, my predecessor in this portfolio worked on a lot in the spring, but it's work that I'm going to continue to do. And in fact, I had this conversation with Northern premiers. I'm also the Intergovernmental Affairs Minister. In my conversations with Northern premiers, this issue has also been raised, and I'm happy to work with them and other groups across the country.
Bill C-21 is not without controversy, to say the least, and being the sponsor of the bill, I've got an earful from on both sides of the spectrum on this. And yes. Now, a lot has been said on both sides of the spectrum in regard to what the bill is and isn't to a large extent. And as a country, I think my colleague Senator Plett said this earlier in his remarks, and I think Senator O said the same thing. I mean, Canadians are concerned, especially in urban environment, about gun violence. It's a real issue. And it's hard not to go an evening or a day without not hearing of gun violence in our society. So how do we dialogue with each other in a way that respects the need for legislation that's going to help, of course, protect Canadians from the harm that we see all the time? And secondly, how do we find, I guess, the fortitude to recognize there are things we need to do as a society for the greater good of society, especially on the question of gun violence? Because we live to our neighbors to the south, who have a different perspective on this issue, and I hope that we don't fall in the trap. So maybe from your responsibility as minister and intergovernment minister.
30 seconds, it would be appreciated.
Well, I like the way when Senator Youssef began, he said, if I don't know the answers, he can get them from the officials after I leave. So, so Senator, your question, and this is the struggle of successive governments in this space. It's not new to our government. Legislating in this area brings with it understandable reactions from people who are concerned. There is a significant amount of misinformation that circulates in this space as well. Some of it, as you say, is fueled by an American constitutional provision or American interests that come across the border and in social media, on the internet. So it's not easy to have, in many cases, a conversation that identifies exactly the balance, Senator, that I think you expressed that many Canadians share. How do we respect the rights of lawful, law-abiding sports persons, hunters that use firearms in a perfectly appropriate way, but also deal with the increasing challenge of gun violence, including the use of weapons, and the RCMP and others can speak to this, that are increasingly violent, military-style assault rifles. That some of the crime scenes and some of the investigations that the RCMP have told me they're doing are involving increasingly high-powered, violent, or high-powered weapons that are being used to perpetrate violence with devastating consequences. So law enforcement needs new tools and modern tools, and we think that this bill is part of the step, part of that, of those steps in that direction. But we recognize that there'll still be more work to do once this legislation, we hope, gets royal assent, because there are things that will constantly evolve as the threat evolves.
Thank you. Thanks, Minister. Senator Kuchar.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for being with us. Like others around the table, I've received hundreds and hundreds of emails from concerned Canadians, and I want to thank them for reaching out. My question is to seek your response to two of the issues that I have raised with me. The first issue that I hear about over and over again is that this bill will not impact criminals in illegal use of guns, and therefore it's unnecessary and unwarranted, which is a different perspective than what I read on the Public Safety Canada website, which says this bill is part of a comprehensive strategy to address gun violence and strengthen gun control in Canada. So these are quite different, and I'd like you to comment on that. And then the second part of this question is that this bill takes away the property rights of Canadians to own guns. I'm aware of the 1993 Supreme Court ruling that found that Canadians do not have a constitutional right to own firearms, and the arguments that owning guns is a privilege, not a right. But I wonder if you could help clarify the issue around property rights and the guns.
So, Senator, thank you for the question. Thank you for the work you're doing on a series of issues across the country that are important to me and to many people. So I laud you for that work and thank you. I said to Deputy Commissioner Flynn, maybe he can go into the specific difference between what may be on the Public Security Department website and what we believe is an important tool for law enforcement to have in the continued fight against the illegal use and violent use of firearms. The second part, if I can, Senator, just your question around property rights, I'm glad you used that phrase, because that is an example, I think, of some of the confusion that comes from our neighbors to the south. They're 10 times our size. They're very loud on these issues. I have people that come to my constituency office sometimes and talk about whether a grand jury is going to indict somebody. And that comes from watching American TV shows. So there's a lot of confusion around some legal concepts that have their roots in American constitutional law. You referred to a Supreme Court case. It's not an issue of property rights. It's an issue of responsible criminal law enacted by Parliament to keep Canadians safe. That's how we look at this particular question. And I think that that's an importation of an American phrase that, and I'm not a constitutional law expert, we have Matthews in the Department of Justice perhaps can give you more. I don't think that that has a lot of application in the criminal code changes in Canada, but he could go into that, Senator, on more detail. But Mark, did you want to pick up on the first part of the Senator's question?
Yeah, so I'll just provide a little bit of information that I hope will help characterize our view or my view on this. So gang-related homicides involving firearms increased by 27% in 2021. Okay. Also, if you look at the number of firearms that we've traced through our tracing efforts, 69% of those firearms were deemed to have legally been imported or manufactured in Canada. So when you combine those two facts together, you see that legal firearms that are in Canada are likely contributing to the pool of firearms that are being used in gang-related and organized crime homicides. So anything that helps from a policing perspective remove the available resources for gangs and organized crime to commit these violent acts is beneficial for public safety and obviously the police and our mandate to enforce the law.
Let's move to Senator Anderson, who will be followed by Senator Deakin, Ontario, Senator Dasco, and Senator Beam. Senator Anderson.
Plenini Chair, and thank you, Minister LeBlanc, for your attendance. Minister LeBlanc, you spoke about recognizing and upholding the rights of Indigenous peoples. Yet in Bill C-21 under Section 110.1 sub 1, there are processes for an ex parte application to a provincial court for an order prohibiting another person from possessing any firearm, crossbow, prohibited weapon, restricted weapon, prohibited device, ammunition, prohibited ammunition, or explosive substances, or all such things if the person believes on reasonable grounds that it's not desirable in the interests of the safety of the person against whom the order is sought, or of any person that the person against whom the order is sought should possess any such thing. So this is the ex parte. So this is at the risk of further creating disparities in the three territories, in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and the Yukon, and criminalizing individuals. I point out to you that in domestic cases, there is a suspicion of probable cause, whereas in Bill C-21 works on reasonable grounds, quote, not desirable in the interest of the safety of the person against whom the order is sought, end of quote. In Bill C-21, there appears to be a presumption of guilt when there are no reasonable grounds to have proven that there has been an offense committed. This is problematic. And I want to point out that, Minister Blanc, you spoke a lot about hunters and sport hunters. For some, this goes beyond hunting and sport hunting, and that's the case for the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and the Yukon. This is how we survive. This is how we feed our families, a matter of ensuring food security for our families and for our communities. So to be lumped in with sport hunters and hunters is not a clear definition. In the North, we also have traveling courts with intermittent scheduled courts in the communities, as well as 2 to 3 generations who live in the same home, and a reliance in many communities to ensure safety from predatory animals, as well as subsistence hunting to address food security and disparities we face in the North. Can you tell me, between the mandate, UNDRIP, and addressing systemic inequities and disparities, how Bill C-21, given what I have just stated, have factored and taken into account the realities in the Northwest Territories, Nunavut, and the Yukon?
So, Senator, thank you for the questions, plural, because there are a number of very good questions. So I wouldn't purport to say we've lumped in sports persons or hunters in the South with, as you properly note, residents in the North for whom hunting is very much food security. I was Minister of Northern Affairs for a number of months and learned a great deal about food security, the Northern Food Program, and totally accept your premise that for many people in Canada's North, that the access to firearms is very much a question of food security and a traditional way of life that we want to respect. And we believe that this legislation entirely supports and respects that particular issue. The front part of your question, Senator, and as I say, we had a number of consultations with Northern governments, Northern Indigenous groups, and my colleagues would be happy to share with you an extensive list of people from whom we sought input. But at the front end of your question, you were identifying, I think, the provisions of the law around the red flag provisions. And again, Matthew will very quickly, Mr. Chair, the question was long. I'll try and keep the answer short. But I want Matthew to be able, I think, to explain what my instinct, having not practiced in this area of law before, it's not a criminal finding. It's not this is about giving law enforcement a chance on a protective basis for a temporary order to remove a firearm, as opposed to a criminal. We're not criminalizing people. We're trying to protect potential victims in a way. But I totally take, I've had friends that worked on circuit courts in the north. It is a different context, and maybe Matthew could explain. I just wouldn't want us to look like we're criminalizing people when we're in fact trying to protect potential victims of domestic violence by a temporary order. Matthew?
Thank you, Minister. And sorry, but maybe we can come back to this in the second part. If we could, we have to move on. We've got 5 senators still waiting on the list. Senator Deakin, Ontario, is next, followed by Senator Dasko.
Thank you, and hello, Minister and officials and support. Thank you for all of you being here today. 2 things, 2 questions I hope I can get in. One, you've heard it, we've heard from many, many Canadians and non-Canadians, and we've met with many groups and many, many Canadians, and great range. For me, the youngest was a 7-year-old boy and a 93-year-old woman. That represents quite a diversity, I think, in this country. And one of the common, if you look at distill everything we have and everything we receive, one of the most common pieces that comes to us is that farmers will not be able to farm, do their work, and that hunters will not be able to hunt and do their work. Just a quick response, and if you have those Canadians in front of you, what would you be saying to them?
Senator, thank you for the question. I think that assertion is not accurate, and I've heard it as you have and as we all have. People assert that farmers or people in rural communities that need firearms for pest control purposes and other hunters, sports persons, people using firearms in northern and indigenous communities, they're not targeted or affected or included in these measures that we're trying to have adopted to specifically go after persons using weapons that are designed specifically to kill the greatest number of people in the shortest amount of time. I have cousins in New Brunswick that go hunting for moose. They don't go to war with moose. This is a fundamental difference. So I think that, but I'm not surprised. I've been sitting in Parliament for 23 years. I've seen various versions of gun control measures. Accuracy and reliability in terms of what people say is often lost in the opening moments of this conversation. That's fine. I'm serene with that. We're doing the best we can in a minority parliament to have legislation adopted that we think makes a significant difference in protecting communities and people. But we recognize that there's more to be done, and we'll continue to work with parliamentarians in both places to figure out the best way forward.
Thank you. And I think we're all trying to refine, define, try to work through disinformation. So here's maybe a part B for this too. When we look at some of the communication we've had, and that is, no doubt there's a concern in our sports shooting communities about this legislation. And while there isn't exemptions for elite level Olympian shooters, there's still confusion about how such labels will be determined, and also if some will be the last generation of sports shooters in Canada because novices would be unable to train at this level. I have led many shooters into this country in big multi-sport games. They are unique athletes, and they're so proud to wear that leaf on their back. How are we going to make sure they're still able to do that?
Senator, very, very good question. And I, in my briefings and understanding of the legislation, was very reassured that we're not affecting the ability of these elite athletes to access the firearms they need for their sporting competitions. And it's not only the persons that go to these international competitions representing Canada, it's those that are training and getting ready for one day, hopefully having the opportunity to do that. But Talal, you and I talked about this just to reassure the Senator with respect to the elite sport shooters.
Absolutely. And we've been discussing this for a while now with Parliament and with the stakeholders as well. Obviously, I believe you're referring to the handgun freeze and not to the long guns, but the assault-style firearms. The handgun freeze will have provisions that will be more detailed in regulations, so further consultations will take place to clearly establish the process for exactly the sport shooter and the people who will be training on how we will establish it. The legislation right now is giving the framework from a legal perspective, but further regulations will come and will continue, right? Go ahead. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Dasko is next. I'm sure we'll be coming back to this one later. Senator Dasko.
Thank you, Minister and officials, for being here. And, this is a very important bill. I live in Toronto. There have been so many incidents of gun crime, and yet Toronto is a safe city, and yet we hear these stories all the time, so it's very scary for us, for those of us who live there and want to continue to live in a safe community. I wanted to explore a little deeper the issue of assault-style weapons. The bill includes a ban on future assault-style weapons, but does not affect those that are currently in circulation and are currently legal. And I would like just to get a better sense of what are your plans to deal with existing assault weapons. Last fall, you introduced in amendments a list of 482 models that you felt were dangerous. I would like to get a commitment from you that those guns are going to be made illegal. And I want to know a real commitment from you as to how that's going to be handled. We just, the situation is just not acceptable to have tens of thousands of guns out there that are illegal, and we're talking just about the guns that we're going to deal with down the road. So anyway, that's my question.
So, Mr. Chair, through you to Senator Dasko, and you're right, your city, like other large Canadian cities, has seen an alarming increase, as Deputy Commissioner Flynn said, in these violent crimes. Many of them, not all of them, using some of these weapons that we're seeking to prohibit. So I think a couple of points, perhaps. The firearms, the buyback provisions, many people purchased lawfully a gun that was available that they ordered from a distributor. Many of them received them by Canada Post. Guns that, by the order in council, we now want to prohibit. So we need an appropriate way to, if we're going to remove these guns from people who purchased them lawfully, we need the appropriate way to compensate them, and that's exactly what the buyback program will do. The issue about, and that's 1,500 and some models. Talal and others could, Senator, give you the precise numbers in terms of the models that will no longer be lawfully permitted. But this is an evolving space, as you said, and the technology and the manufacturers are designing, whether it's magazine size, you can modify a particular magazine. A number of these things need to form part of a regulatory package following royal assent. We think having the Firearms Advisory Committee of experts is precisely a way to deal with that group of weapons. Putting them 482 in a legislative amendment at the other place was going to ensure that we weren't going to get this legislation adopted. So in a minority parliament, we worked with opposition parties and came up with what we thought is a thoughtful compromise that moves us in the direction that you articulated, for which I am totally in agreement. But the Firearms Advisory Committee will be a way to get expert advice on how to, in the regulatory context that Talal spoke about a minute ago, ensure that we're continuing the process of removing these guns that don't have a place in the lawful pursuit of sports activities or sustenance hunting, and that are causing such threat and concern and so much carnage in cities like the great city of Toronto.
Thank you, Minister. I'm looking at the clock. We've got three more senators. We've got time for two, Senators Beam and Boisvenu. If we have very succinct questions and succinct answers. So Senator Beam is first. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. I will be succinct. Minister, good to see you. Thanks for being here with your team. Most of my questions have already been asked, but I just wanted to make one observation and then a question. This bill is a very controversial bill. We all know that. It has traveled back and forth through the other place, which we call the other place, your place. Amendments have been put in, amendments have been withdrawn. You're new in the portfolio, so you've inherited this. It's with us now. You mentioned that you're still meeting with groups. You're seeing Police Souvien. And my question is, there will have to be an outreach campaign on this when this legislation is passed, as I'm assuming it will be, whether it's amended or not. Are you meeting with the sports shooting federations, with the hunting groups and associations and others who have a very valid interest in how this bill is going to be applied?
Mr. Chair, so through you to Senator Beam, it's a privilege to see you, Senator. I had a chance to work with Senator Beam when I was a young assistant in Mr. Chrétien's office 30 years ago, Senator Beam.
I was the same age then.
So I'm very happy to see you and very happy to say to you in unequivocal terms the answer is yes, because we share your view that as we look at regulatory changes, we hope the legislation, as I said, gets to royal assent, but the regulatory work is not done. There'll be government programs around prevention. There'll be the buyback program, which is a complicated space to operate in. So we'll have to continue in a thoughtful way to respect all of the groups who have very legitimate concerns. We think and hope we can answer their concerns, and we'll continue to diligently work down that list and ensure that it's balanced for exactly the reasons you said.
Thank you.
Senator Boivin.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Bienvenue, Monsieur le Ministre. Monsieur le Ministre, j'aimerais vous parler du programme d'acquisition des armes illégales ou des armes que vous avez inscrit au projet de loi. Et le directeur parlementaire parlait de montant de 750 millions. Est-ce que vous êtes d'accord avec ce montant-là?
Vous parlez du coût du programme de rachat, c'est ça?
Du rachat qui a été prolongé jusqu'en 2025, je pense.
C'est ça. C'est l'amnistie, si c'est le mot en français, que nous avons prolongé précisément pour ne pas criminaliser, pas rendre les gens...
Est-ce que le montant de 750 millions est prévu par le directeur du budget et votre montant à vous?
Nous n'avons pas finalisé les dernières modalités de notre programme. Alors moi, j'ai vu des ébauches de documents au ministère. Nous travaillons, y compris avec des partenaires. J'en ai parlé longuement avec le ministre Bonnardel du Québec quant au besoin d'avoir l'appui, par exemple, du Sûreté de Québec. Alors, les détails, c'est une des raisons pourquoi on n'a pas annoncé les dernières modalités ou les modalités finales de notre programme de rachat, parce que nous sommes évidemment conscients du coût. Mais c'est un engagement que nous avons fait lors de la dernière élection et nous avons pleinement l'intention de mettre sur pied un tel programme. Mais nous sommes conscients des coûts. Alors, je ne veux pas m'aventurer sur le directeur parlementaire du budget n'a pas vu les détails de notre programme. Alors, pour ne pas enlever sa capacité de vous donner des analyses, c'est peut-être précoce un peu.
Mon autre question, M. le ministre, c'est que le syndicat des agents carcéraux, de qui relèvent les pénitenciers de votre ministère, Cowansville, juste en 3 mois, ils ont intercepté pour 700 000 $ d'armes illégales et de drogue, et on pense qu'en 2023, c'est près de 2 millions de valeur. Et les armes à feu illégales dans les pénitenciers, c'est un fléau au Canada, et ces armes-là rentrent souvent par des drones. Le syndicat me dit que ça fait maintenant 8 ans qu'il demande au ministère de fournir des équipements adéquats pour pouvoir intercepter ces armes qui mettent en péril la sécurité des gardiens, la sécurité des autres détenus. Alors, il ne s'est rien passé depuis 8 ans pour bien équiper les pénitenciers pour détecter ces armes-là. Est-ce que vous avez un plan de travail pour intervenir à ce niveau-là? Je comprends qu'on peut intervenir dans les gangs de rue, mais les gangs de rue se ramassent dans les pénitenciers puis se ramassent avec les mêmes armes. Et le projet de loi-là ne viendra pas changer la situation.
Et là, je suis d'accord avec vous, sénateur, dans le sens que, puis c'était dans ma première discussion avec la commissaire des services correctionnels, on a abordé précisément cette question-là. L'arrivée des drones, c'est une façon par excellence pour des personnes de crime organisé de s'assurer qu'ils essayent d'envoyer la drogue ou, pire, des armes à feu ou d'autres armes dans le milieu carcéral. Moi aussi, j'ai un prison fédéral à Dorchester, au Nouveau-Brunswick, dans mon comté, que j'ai visité à maintes reprises comme député. Je suis conscient de ces inquiétudes-là. Je rencontre d'ailleurs le syndicat des officiers correctionnels à Montréal jeudi de cette semaine. Alors, j'ai bien hâte de poursuivre la conversation. Mais je suis tout à fait je ne pense pas que ça prend des mesures législatives. Vous avez raison, ça prend des outils, un financement et un appui aux personnes extraordinaires qui travaillent dans le milieu carcéral. Moi, les gens que j'ai rencontrés au fil des années font face à des moments très difficiles, une insécurité en croissance. Alors moi, ce sera mon travail de faire tout ce que je peux pour les appuyer, y compris leur donner des outils et des ressources nécessaires, parce que la sécurité à l'intérieur de ces institutions-là devra inquiéter tout le monde, parce qu'il y a des mille et des mille fonctionnaires qui sont sujets à ces menaces tous les jours.
Thank you. Minister,
Mr. Chair, was there one more senator had a question?
There was. You're absolutely right.
Si le sénateur Méville-Deschênes, moi, je ne veux pas interrompre le président, mais moi, ça me fera plaisir de prendre sa question. Moi, je veux que vous soyez gentil avec moi, voyez-vous.
Ça va? Donc, je serai rapide, Monsieur le ministre. Je veux me faire l'écho aux inquiétudes de Police se souvient sur particulièrement les armes de style armes d'assaut. Donc, vous avez choisi, je le comprends, d'interdire certaines de ces armes par la voie de la réglementation. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous donner des garanties ici? Parce que vous avez dit un comité aviseur qui va réfléchir, qui va s'y pencher, qui va décider. Est-ce qu'on peut s'attendre à ce que 6 mois après l'entrée en vigueur du projet de loi, nous ayons en effet cette réglementation? Et je vous dirais, si je suis un peu généreuse, 1 an. Est-ce que vous pouvez vous engager ici à ce qu'on ait une réglementation en vigueur 6 mois après l'entrée en vigueur de la loi, ou tout au moins 1 an? Parce qu'autrement, on le sait, ces affaires-là, ça traîne, et tout ce qui traîne se salit.
Je n'avais pas entendu cette expression-là, mais je l'aime bien. Écoutez, moi, je comprends, et j'ai partagé ça avec les représentants de Police se souvient, comme j'ai dit ce matin. Je comprends l'urgence. Je n'accepte pas que 2 ans, 3 ans après, on n'a pas finalisé ça. Moi, j'ai l'intention d'agir et je suis prêt à vous assurer sans hésitation d'agir le plus vite possible. Moi, je suis conscient de d'autres délais. C'est un problème pour nous. Il y a des délais sur le plan électoral. C'est pas un sujet qui vous préoccupe peut-être beaucoup ici. Mais nous sommes très inquiets par ça. Moi,
c'est
moi, je serais très déçu si ça nous prend 1 an. Moi, honnêtement, je n'essaie pas d'éviter votre question. J'ai d'ailleurs accepté de prendre votre question, puis c'est une très bonne question, et je la respecte beaucoup. Un processus réglementaire, moi, j'en ai vu quand je siégeais au Conseil du Trésor, il y a des périodes d'avis, il y a des consultations, mais ça ne devra pas être un prétexte pour un retard ou pour ne pas arriver le plus vite possible au bon moment. Moi, je serais très surpris, puis je regarde tout à l'heure, si dans 1 an, on n'a pas bouclé ça, là. 6 mois, si c'est dans 6 mois, 7 mois, tant mieux. Mais je ne sais pas le processus juridique dans la loi, de Canada Gazette, tous ces éléments-là. Moi, je ne veux pas aventurer une réponse.
Ça ne peut pas être un engagement plutôt que de dire... Pardon.
Non, Madame la sénatrice, c'est un engagement. J'essaie pas d'éviter la question, mais je ne veux pas vous induire en erreur. Ce sera le plus vite possible. Puis si ce n'est pas dans 1 an, moi, je serai aussi déçu que vous. Alors, je m'engage à ne pas arriver à ce point-là. Merci à vous.
Minister, thank you for being with us today. Colleagues, this brings us to the end of our time with Minister LeBlanc. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for the extra time, and thank you for the work you do in this job and the other jobs that have been assigned to you. So we're very grateful to you. Senators, Mr. DeKalb, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Flynn have agreed to stay behind and will continue answering our questions for the remainder of the panel. And they'll be joined at the table at the very least by Aaron McCrory, Vice President, Intelligence and Enforcement at the Canada Border Services Agency. We'll now suspend briefly to see the Minister out of the room.